The real reason Vikings vanished for hundreds of years, the Vikings were the most feared people in Europe. Their ships appeared from dark oceans without warning. Villages burned. Kingdoms collapsed. Entire coastlines lived in fear of seeing dragon-headed ships emerge from the fog. To the people of medieval Europe, the Vikings looked unstoppable. They crossed oceans no one else dared to sail. They survived brutal storms, freezing seas, and impossible journeys. But despite all their strength, despite all their victories, the Vikings eventually disappeared. And the truth behind their collapse is far darker than most people realize. They were not destroyed by a massive empire. They were not wiped out in one final battle. Instead, they slowly vanished because of something no warrior could fight: the cold. The Viking Age officially began in the year 793 AD, when Viking raiders attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne in England. The attack shocked Europe. Monks who survived described terrifying warriors arriving from the sea like demons. The Vikings stole gold, burned buildings, and disappeared before armies could respond. That single raid marked the beginning of an age that would last nearly 300 years. Soon, Viking fleets spread across Europe. They attacked England, Ireland, France, and parts of Eastern Europe. Some Vikings traveled so far south that they reached the Mediterranean Sea. Others sailed west into the icy Atlantic Ocean, searching for new land. The Vikings came mainly from the regions we now call Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. But unlike the image most people imagine today, not every Viking was a warrior. In fact, most were ordinary people trying to survive. They were farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, and traders. Their entire civilization depended on the land and the sea working together. Farming in Scandinavia was never easy. Winters were long and brutal. Snow covered the ground for months. Crops could fail after a single bad season. Survival depended on careful preparation and good weather. If the harvest failed, families starved. But during the early Viking Age, nature unexpectedly helped them. Historians believe Northern Europe entered a period called the medieval warm period. Temperatures became slightly warmer across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. That small climate shift changed everything. Warmer summers meant longer growing seasons. Crops could survive farther north than before. Viking populations grew quickly because there was finally enough food to support larger communities. As villages expanded, many Vikings began searching for new land across the sea. Their ships became the key to their success. Viking longships were some of the most advanced vessels in the world at the time. They were light, flexible, and fast. Vikings could sail through deep oceans or shallow rivers using the same ship. This allowed them to travel almost anywhere. They reached Iceland around the late 800s and later settled Greenland under the leadership of a famous Viking explorer named Eric the Red. Some Vikings even reached North America nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus arrived there. To Europe, the Vikings looked invincible. Kings paid them money to stop attacks because defeating them was nearly impossible. Viking warriors became legendary for their brutality in battle. Stories spread about giant axes, berserkers, and fearless raids. But while Europe focused on Viking strength, very few people noticed the weakness hidden underneath their empire. The Vikings depended entirely on nature staying stable. Their farms sat on the edge of survival even during good years. The warm climate allowed them to expand farther north than earlier generations thought possible. But many Viking settlements existed in places where farming was incredibly dangerous. Greenland is one of the greatest examples. When Vikings first arrived there, parts of the coastline were green enough for limited farming and raising animals. That is one reason Eric the Red supposedly named the island Greenland. The name encouraged settlers to move there. For a while, the colonies survived successfully. Families raised sheep, goats, and cattle. Churches were built. Trade routes connected Greenland to Europe. It looked like the Vikings had conquered even the frozen edge of the world. But the environment around them was fragile. Even small temperature changes could destroy everything they built. Most Viking families stored food for winter months because they knew survival depended on preparation. Livestock had to survive freezing conditions. They needed to be collected before snow arrived. Fishing and hunting helped communities survive, but farming remained the center of Viking life. And when weather conditions became unpredictable, fear spread quickly through settlements. One failed harvest could already push families towards starvation. Multiple failed harvests could destroy entire communities. For a while, however, the Vikings continued growing stronger. Scandinavian kingdoms became wealthier through trade and raids. Viking merchants sold fur, ivory, timber, and slaves across Europe and the Middle East. Their influence spread everywhere. Some Vikings even became kings in foreign lands. In England, Viking rulers controlled huge territories for years. In France, Viking descendants eventually became the Normans, the same people who later conquered England in 1066. The Viking world appeared unstoppable. But while their power expanded, nature itself was beginning to change. Far to the north, temperatures slowly started dropping. At first, nobody understood what was happening. Seasons became less predictable. Winters lasted longer than before. Storms became more violent across the North Atlantic. Crops that once survived suddenly failed. Ice began appearing earlier every year. For Viking farmers living in already harsh environments, these small changes were terrifying, and this was only the beginning. The same cold that would eventually erase entire Viking settlements had already started moving silently across the world. By the 1200s, the climate across the North Atlantic had changed dramatically. Historians now call this period the Little Ice Age. Temperatures across Europe and the Arctic slowly began falling year after year. At first, the changes seemed small. Summers became shorter, winters arrived earlier, storms grew stronger. But for Viking communities already living on the edge of survival, even a slight drop in temperature could become deadly. In Scandinavia, farmers struggled to grow enough food before the snow returned. In Iceland and Greenland, the situation became catastrophic. The soil froze harder each year. Crops stopped growing properly. Hay harvests became smaller, which meant livestock could not survive the winter. Cattle and sheep starved in massive numbers. Families who depended on farming suddenly found themselves trapped in a world where the land no longer supported life. The Vikings had conquered some of the harshest environments on Earth, but now the Earth itself was turning against them. Greenland suffered more than anywhere else. For centuries, Viking settlers there survived through farming, fishing, and trade with Europe. Ships regularly arrived, carrying wood, iron, tools, and supplies that Greenland could not produce on its own. In return, the Vikings exported walrus ivory, animal skins, and other valuable goods back to Europe. This trade kept the colonies alive. But as the climate worsened, the sea became dangerous and unpredictable. Massive sheets of ice began blocking the routes between Greenland and Europe. Ships struggled to reach the island safely. Some never arrived at all. Trade slowly collapsed. Without imported wood and iron, repairing tools and buildings became nearly impossible. Greenland's Viking settlements became isolated from the rest of the world. Then food shortages became severe. It leaves a warning. Collapse of Viking Greenland reveals how dependent every civilization is on climate and stability. Even powerful societies can fail when food systems collapse and nature becomes unpredictable. The Vikings mastered warfare. They mastered navigation. They conquered oceans that terrified the rest of Europe. But they could not control the earth itself. And in the end, nature became stronger than their armies. Today, scientists study ice cores, ancient ruins, archaeological evidence to understand exactly how climate changes affected Viking settlements. The lessons feel strangely modern. Rising temperatures, changing weather patterns, failed harvests, and environmental instability still threaten civilizations around the world today. The Vikings remind us that even the strongest societies are never completely safe from nature. History often remembers civilizations ending through war or invasion. But sometimes civilizations disappear quietly. Sometimes the enemy is invisible. A colder winter, a failed harvest, sea route frozen shut. The Vikings. The final enemy did not arrive carrying swords or banners. It arrived as silence, snow. As endless cold spreading slowly across the North Atlantic, the Vikings once ruled the seas. Their enemies feared their arrival. Their stories became legends repeated for centuries across Europe. But in the end, winter waited patiently while their world weakened year after year. And eventually, the cold erased the Viking Age forever. History does not always end with war. Sometimes civilizations simply freeze.